The night the preacher's daughter lost her faith was the night Deanna Rose lost everything else. 2. The fire that swept through her family's small homestead on the outskirts of Redemption Creek took more than just the humble cabin she'd called home for 22 years. It took her parents, her younger brother, and the small hand-carved cross that had hung above their door since before she was born. Rain pummeled the charred remains as Deanna stood barefoot in her nightgown, having escaped only by chance when she'd stepped outside to fetch water moments before the blaze erupted. The townsfolk whispered as they watched the embers die, speaking in hushed tones about punishment and divine wrath, about the Rose family and their steadfast preaching to a town increasingly given to vice. "The Lord's turned his back on them," said Mrs. Thornton, the shopkeeper's wife, not bothering to lower her voice as Deanna passed by. "Struck them down like Sodom itself." The words cut deeper than any knife. For 22 years, Deanna had been raised to believe in a loving God, a merciful Father. Her own father had preached it every Sunday from the small wooden pulpit in Redemption Creek's only church. But standing in the ashes of everything she'd known, those beliefs crumbled like the blackened timber at her feet. Redemption Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1873, was no place for a woman alone. The mining town had sprung up 5 years prior when silver was discovered in the nearby mountains. What had started as a small settlement had quickly grown into a rough-edged town filled with saloons, brothels, and men seeking fortune. The small church where her father had preached stood as one of the few reminders of civilization, and even that had been losing its congregation as the town grew wilder. With nowhere else to go, Deanna found herself at the home of her father's closest friend in town, Dr. Samuel Wilson. The physician and his wife took her in without question, offering her the small room above their clinic as a temporary shelter. "You can stay as long as you need, child," Mrs. Wilson said, squeezing Deanna's cold hands between her warm ones. "The Lord provides." Deanna bit back the sharp retort that rose to her lips. What had the Lord provided her family but flames and destruction? But she held her tongue out of respect for the kind couple who had opened their home when others had turned away. 3 days after the fire, Sheriff Miller brought news that chilled her to the bone. "The fire wasn't no accident, Miss Rose," he said, hat in hand as he stood in the Wilsons' parlor. "Found coal oil splashed against the back wall. Someone set that fire deliberately." Deanna felt the room spin around her. Who would do such a thing? Sheriff Miller shifted uncomfortably. "Your father had been receiving threats, been preaching hard against the gambling and the brothels, made some powerful enemies in town." That night, Deanna lay awake in her borrowed bed, staring at the ceiling. Her father had never mentioned threats. He'd simply continued his mission to bring God's word to the sinful town, believing his faith would protect them all. And where had that faith led them? To graves hastily dug in the hard Wyoming soil. The next morning, she made her decision. She couldn't stay in Redemption Creek, not with her family's killers walking free, possibly watching her every move. She would head west, to California perhaps, where a woman might make her own way without the shadows of the past following her. With the last of her family's money, a small sum her father had deposited with the bank for emergencies, Deanna purchased a ticket on the stagecoach that would take her to the next town with a rail station. From there, she would make her way west, step by step if necessary. The stage was scheduled to depart in 2 days. Until then, she busied herself gathering what few possessions she had left, a change of clothes donated by the church ladies, her mother's cameo brooch that she'd been wearing the night of the fire, and a small Bible that had belonged to her father, which Dr. Wilson had rescued from the church. She traced her fingers over the worn leather cover of the Bible, remembering her father's hands holding it as he read to them each evening. For a moment, she considered leaving it behind. What use did she have now for the words of a God who had abandoned her? But something stayed her hand. It was the last connection to her father, regardless of what was written inside. The morning the stagecoach was to depart, Deanna rose before dawn. She dressed in her one decent dress, a dark blue calico that had belonged to Mrs. Wilson's daughter, and pinned her mother's cameo at her throat. Her honey-brown hair was tied back simply, and she wore the sturdy boots Dr. Wilson had insisted on purchasing for her journey. "A young woman needs proper footwear for traveling," he'd said kindly, waving away her protests. She'd written a letter of thanks to the Wilsons, leaving it propped against the lamp in her room. They had been nothing but kind, but their constant reassurances that God works in mysterious ways had become almost unbearable. If God worked in such mysterious ways, she wanted nothing to do with his plans. The stagecoach station was already busy when she arrived, men loading mail bags and parcels onto the roof of the coach while passengers milled about, saying goodbyes or securing their belongings. Deanna stood apart, having no one to see her off. She clutched her small carpet bag, containing everything she now owned in the world, and watched the bustling activity with detached interest. "All passengers for Coyote Springs, boarding now," called the station master, a portly man with a thick mustache. Deanna stepped forward, ticket in hand, ready to leave behind the ruins of her former life. As she moved toward the coach, a commotion at the end of the street caught her attention. A group of men on horseback galloped into town, whooping and hollering, pistols firing into the air. "Damn Barker gang," muttered the station master, hurrying the remaining passengers toward the coach. "Get aboard, quick now." The Barker gang was notorious in the territory cattle rustlers and thieves who terrorized small towns and isolated homesteads. That they would ride boldly into Redemption Creek in broad daylight spoke to their growing audacity and the town's inadequate law enforcement. Deanna climbed aboard the coach, finding a seat next to an elderly woman clutching a caged canary. Across from them sat a well-dressed businessman and a young mother with a sleeping child in her arms. The remaining seat was empty as the driver called out final warnings. Just as the door was about to close, a figure appeared, swinging himself into the coach with practiced ease. "Pardon the rush," he said, settling into the empty seat across from Deanna. "Some disagreeable fellows took exception to my card playing." Zachary Blackwell, for that was the name he offered when the businessman inquired, was tall and lean, with sun-darkened skin that spoke of years under the open sky. His clothes were dusty but of good quality, a dark shirt under a leather vest, denim trousers tucked into well-worn boots. A gun belt sat low on his hips, the holster tied down against his thigh. His hat, pushed back on his head, revealed eyes the color of a summer storm and hair the shade of dark walnut. Deanna found herself staring and quickly looked away when those gray eyes met hers. There was something unsettling about the newcomer, a coiled alertness beneath his casual demeanor that reminded her of the mountain lions her father had once pointed out watching them from the ridge above their homestead. The stagecoach lurched forward, beginning the journey that would take her away from Redemption Creek forever. As the town receded behind them, Deanna felt no sadness, only a hollow emptiness where her faith had once resided. "First time traveling alone, madam?" Zachary Blackwell asked, his voice cutting through her thoughts. Deanna stiffened. "How would you know that?" A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Most experienced travelers don't grip their bags quite so tightly. Might want to set it on the floor before your knuckles go permanently white." Embarrassed, Deanna loosened her grip on the carpet bag. "I'm perfectly comfortable, Mr. Blackwell. Just Zach, if you don't mind." "And you are?" "Miss Rose," she replied stiffly, unwilling to offer her given name to a stranger. "Ah, the preacher's daughter," he said, recognition dawning in his eyes. Deanna felt her breath catch. "You knew my father?" Zach shrugged. "Knew of him. Hard not to in a town like Redemption Creek. Man who stands against the tide tends to get noticed." He paused, studying her face. "I heard about what happened. Sorry for your loss." The sincerity in his voice took her by surprise. Unlike the hollow platitudes offered by most of the townsfolk, his simple condolence carried genuine weight. "Thank you," she managed, turning to look out the window at the passing landscape. The journey to Coyote Springs would take 2 days, with an overnight stop at a way station halfway between. Deanna had steeled herself for the uncomfortable travel, but as the hours wore on, she found the rhythmic swaying of the coach and the steady drumming of hooves almost hypnotic. The other passengers made occasional conversation, but mostly kept to themselves. All except Zachary Blackwell. He seemed determined to draw her into conversation, asking questions about her destination and plans. Deanna provided minimal answers, unwilling to share her uncertain future with a stranger. "California's a long way," he remarked when she reluctantly mentioned her ultimate destination. "What's waiting for you there?" "A fresh start," she replied tersely. "Those are harder to come by than you might think," he said, his expression unreadable. "The past has a way of catching up." She met his gaze directly. "Are you speaking from experience, Mr. Blackwell?" The smile that crossed his face didn't quite reach his eyes. "Let's just say I recognized the look of someone running from something." "I'm not running," she protested. "I'm moving forward." "Is there a difference?" The question lingered between them as the coach rattled on through the rugged terrain. By mid-afternoon, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon, promising a storm. The driver pushed the team harder, hoping to reach the way station before the weather broke. They were still an hour out when the first fat droplets of rain began to fall, quickly turning into a downpour. The trail became slick with mud, slowing their progress. Inside the coach, the passengers huddled closer together as water began to leak through the roof in several places. The elderly woman's canary fluttered anxiously in its cage while the young child whimpered in his mother's arms. Zachary removed his coat and offered it to Deanna as water dripped steadily onto her shoulder. "I couldn't possibly," she began. "Just take it," he said, not unkindly. "I've been wetter." Before she could protest further, a crack of thunder split the air, followed by a terrified whinny from the horses. The coach lurched violently to one side, and Deanna was thrown against the wall as screams filled the confined space. "Hold on," Zach shouted, bracing himself against the opposite side. The world tilted as the coach slid off the muddy trail, rolling once before coming to rest at the bottom of a shallow ravine. For a moment, there was only shocked silence, broken by the child's frightened wail and the frantic fluttering of the canary. Deanna found herself sprawled across the tilted floor of the coach, Zach's body partially covering hers. He'd thrown himself across the space to shield her as they tumbled. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his face inches from hers. She took stock quickly. "No, I don't think so." He nodded once, then turned to check on the other passengers. Amazingly, no one seemed seriously injured, though the businessman had a nasty cut on his forehead and the elderly woman was trembling violently. The driver's voice came from outside, cursing colorfully as he assessed the damage. Zach forced the door now positioned above them open and climbed out into the rain. "Stay put," he instructed the passengers. "Let me see how bad it is." Deanna ignored his directive, following him out into the storm. The coach lay on its side in 6 inches of muddy water, one wheel completely shattered. The horses, thankfully still in their traces, stamped and snorted nervously. The driver, a burly man named Jenkins, shook his head grimly when Zach asked about their situation. "Wheels busted beyond repair. We're not going anywhere without help." "How far to the way station?" Zach asked, rain streaming down his face. "On foot? 5-6 miles maybe." Deanna wrapped her arms around herself, already soaked to the skin. The temperature was dropping rapidly as evening approached, and standing in the storm, she could feel the first shivers beginning. "We can't stay here," she said, teeth chattering slightly. "The water's rising." Zach and Jenkins exchanged a look. "She's right," Jenkins conceded. "This ravine'll fill fast in a storm like this. We need to get everyone to higher ground, at least." What followed was a sodden, miserable procession. Jenkins freed the team and fashioned leads from the harnesses. The businessman and Zach helped the elderly woman navigate the slippery slope while Deanna assisted the young mother with her child. Their belongings were distributed among them, though many had been ruined in the crash. Deanna's carpetbag had survived mostly intact, but was thoroughly soaked. She clutched it anyway, unwilling to part with the few possessions she had left. The group followed the road on foot, heads bowed against the driving rain. After a mile, the elderly woman began to falter, her steps growing unsteady. "We need to find shelter," Zach called over the storm to Jenkins. "Mrs. Ellsworth won't make it all the way to the station." Jenkins squinted through the rain. "There's an old line shack about half a mile off the road, used by the cattle drivers during roundup. Might still be standing." The detour took them through dense underbrush, now running with rivulets of rainwater. By the time the dilapidated structure came into view, darkness had nearly fallen. The line shack was little more than a one-room cabin with a sagging roof, but it was dry inside, and that was all that mattered. Jenkins and Zach worked quickly to start a fire in the small stone hearth, while the others huddled together for warmth. Deanna helped the young mother who had introduced herself as Sarah settle her son on a rough pallet fashioned from their coats. "Thank you for your kindness," Sarah whispered, brushing damp hair from her sleeping child's face. "Not many would bother with a woman traveling alone with a child." Deanna smiled thinly. "We're all in this together." Once the fire was crackling steadily, they took turns moving closer to dry their clothes as best they could. The businessman, Mr. Gregory from Denver, had packed a flask of brandy, which he generously shared with Mrs. Ellsworth to ward off the chill. Jenkins assessed their supplies. Between them, they had enough food for a meager meal that evening, but nothing beyond that. "I'll head out at first light," he announced. "Make for the station and bring back help. Rest of you should stay put." No one argued with his plan. With the storm still raging outside and night fully upon them, travel would be dangerous at best. As the others settled in for the night, arranging themselves as comfortably as possible in the cramped space, Deanna found herself seated beside Zach near the fire. He'd been quiet since they'd arrived at the shack, keeping his observations to himself as he worked to ensure everyone's comfort. "You handled yourself well today," he said finally, voice low enough not to disturb the others. "Not everyone would keep their head in a situation like that." Deanna stared into the flames. "When you've lost everything, a little adversity seems manageable." He studied her profile in the firelight. "Is that what happened? You lost everything?" "My family died in a fire 3 weeks ago," she said, the words coming more easily than she'd expected. "Someone burned our home with them inside." Zach was silent for a long moment. "And you weren't there?" "I stepped out for water when I returned." She shook her head, unable to continue. "So you're heading to California to start fresh?" "There's nothing left for me in Redemption Creek except memories I'd rather forget." Thunder crashed outside, causing the small cabin to shudder. Zach added another piece of wood to the fire. "What about you?" Deanna asked, suddenly curious. "What brings a man like you out this way?" He smiled faintly. "A man like me? You're not a businessman like Mr. Gregory, nor a farmer. You carry a gun like you know how to use it, and you were in an awful hurry to leave Redemption Creek." "Observant," he acknowledged. "I'm what you might call a professional gambler." And there was a disagreement about a hand of poker just before I boarded the coach. "You cheated," she stated flatly. His smile widened. "I never cheat, Miss Rose. I don't need to. Some folks just can't accept that luck favors certain people over others. And you believe luck favors you? Zach glanced around the dilapidated shack. Perhaps not today. Despite herself, Deanna felt a smile tug at her lips. There was something disarming about his honesty. You should get some rest, he said, noticing the fatigue she was trying to hide. Tomorrow will be another long day. What about you? I'll keep watch for a while. Make sure the fire doesn't die out. Deanna nodded, suddenly too exhausted to argue. She moved away from the fire to make room for others and settled against the wall, using her damp carpetbag as a pillow. Despite the discomfort, sleep claimed her quickly. She dreamed of fire, of her family calling for help that never came, of standing outside their burning home, pounding on doors that wouldn't open. She woke with a strangled cry, sitting bolt upright in the darkness. Easy, came Zach's voice, closer than she expected. He sat beside her, his back against the same wall. Just a dream. Deanna took a shuddering breath, willing her racing heart to slow. Did I wake everyone? No, they're all still asleep. He paused. Fire dreams. She nodded, not trusting her voice. I get them too sometimes, he admitted softly. Different fire, same terror. In the dim light from the banked coals, she could just make out his profile. What happened? He was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Border raiders. I was 14. They burned our ranch with my parents inside. I was out checking fence lines with my older brother. The similarity to her own tragedy stole her breath. What did you do? Survived. My brother and I drifted for a while. He joined the Union Army during the war. Died at Antietam. He spoke matter-of-factly, as if reciting events that had happened to someone else. I found I had a talent for cards and a good eye with a pistol. Made my way as best I could. I'm sorry about your family, she whispered. He shrugged. It was a long time ago. Does it ever stop hurting? No, he said honestly. But you learn to carry it differently after a while. It becomes part of you, not all of you. They sat in companionable silence, listening to the storm gradually subsiding outside. Eventually, Deanna drifted back to sleep, more peacefully this time, oddly comforted by the presence of the enigmatic gambler beside her. Morning arrived with watery sunshine filtering through the cabin's single window. Jenkins departed early, promising to return with help by evening. The remaining passengers spent the day making the best of their situation, sharing what food remained and taking turns venturing outside as the ground slowly dried. Deanna found herself watching Zach throughout the day. He was unfailingly polite to Mrs. Ellsworth, patient with Sarah's curious son, and engaged Mr. Gregory in conversation about business prospects in the Western Territories. There was more to him than the dangerous gunslinger she'd initially taken him for. By late afternoon, there was still no sign of Jenkins or rescue. Mr. Gregory suggested they might need to start walking toward the way station the following morning if help didn't arrive. We could be stuck here for days otherwise, he argued, and we're nearly out of provisions. Zach frowned. The ground's still soft. It would be slow going, especially for Mrs. Ellsworth and the boy. I can manage, the elderly woman insisted, though she looked pale and tired. Before the debate could continue, Zach held up a hand, head tilted as if listening. Riders coming, he said, moving to the door. The approaching horsemen were not Jenkins and rescue from the way station. Instead, 5 rough-looking men rode into view, their horses mud-splattered and lathered. Inside, Zach ordered sharply, closing the door and dropping the bar across it. Everyone away from the windows. What is it? Sarah asked, clutching her son to her chest. Trouble, Zach replied grimly, checking his pistol. Those are the Barker boys. Same ones who were raising hell in Redemption Creek yesterday. Deanna felt cold fear sweep through her. The Barker gang was known for their brutality. Robbery was the least of their crimes. What do they want? Mr. Gregory whispered. Nothing good, Zach replied. And they'll have seen the smoke from our fire. They know we're here. As if to confirm his words, a voice called from outside. We know you're in there. Come on out nice and peaceful. And nobody needs to get hurt. Zach moved to the window, staying to one side as he peered out. 5 of them, all armed. They've got Jenkins with them. Deanna joined him at the window, ignoring his gesture to stay back. Through the grimy glass, she could see the stagecoach driver on his knees before the mounted men, hands bound behind his back. What do we do? She whispered. Zach's expression was grim. They outnumber us, and they have the advantage of position. You folks got 10 seconds to open this door, called the voice again. Or we start by putting a bullet in this one's head. We have to do something, Deanna insisted. Zach studied her face, then nodded once. Stay behind me, he instructed the group. Let me do the talking. He unbarred the door and stepped onto the small porch, hands carefully visible at his sides. Deanna and the others remained clustered in the doorway behind him. The leader of the gang, a broad-shouldered man with a thick beard, grinned nastily from atop his horse. Well, well, quite the collection of travelers. How fortunate we found you all safe and sound. What do you want, Barker? Zach asked, his voice level. The leader's eyes narrowed. Do I know you? We've never had the pleasure. But your reputation precedes you. Barker laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. Ain't that something? A famous man I am. His eyes scanned the group, lingering on Deanna and Sarah. Now, as to what we want, I reckon you folks might have valuables we could take off your hands. Watches, money, jewelry. Ladies' company for the night. Sarah made a small, frightened sound behind Deanna. The women aren't part of any deal, Zach said flatly. Ain't your call to make, Mr. Barker replied, his hand dropping to his gun. Unless you're fixing to stop us? The tension stretched taut between them. Deanna could see Zach calculating the odds. 5 armed men against 1, with innocent bystanders at risk. I've got $20 and a gold pocket watch, Mr. Gregory said suddenly, stepping forward. Take it and leave us be. Barker smirked. That's a start. What happened next unfolded with shocking speed. As the gang dismounted and approached, Zach moved with the fluid grace of a predator. His gun cleared its holster in a blur, and the first shot caught Barker's right-hand man squarely in the chest. Inside, Zach shouted, shoving Deanna toward the door as he fired again. Chaos erupted. Gunshots echoed as Deanna and the others scrambled back into the cabin. Zach backed in after them, firing methodically. Through the window, Deanna saw 2 of the gang members down, a third clutching his arm. Barker and the remaining man had taken cover behind their horses. Everyone down, Zach ordered, ducking as bullets splintered the door frame. Deanna huddled with Sarah and her son beneath the room's only table, while Mr. Gregory and Mrs. Ellsworth pressed themselves against the far wall. Outside, Jenkins had managed to roll himself behind a water trough, out of the immediate line of fire. They've got us pinned, Zach muttered, checking his ammunition. And they'll be mighty upset about their friends. What do we do? Deanna asked, her heart pounding so hard she could barely hear over the rush of blood in her ears. Zach's eyes met hers, and something passed between them, an unspoken communication. There's a back window, he said quietly. Small, but a person could squeeze through, if someone could circle around. I'll go, she said immediately. Absolutely not, he countered. I'm the smallest adult here, she argued, and I grew up hunting with my father. I know how to move quietly. Another volley of bullets hit the cabin, sending splinters flying. "You ever shoot a man, Miss Rose?" Zach asked, his voice low. Deanna swallowed hard. "No, but I can free Jenkins. Even the odds a bit." After a moment's hesitation, Zach nodded. He handed her a small knife from his boot. "Cut Jenkins loose if you can. Stay low, stay quiet. I'll keep them distracted." Heart racing, Deanna crawled to the back of the cabin. The window was indeed small, but she managed to wriggle through, dropping silently to the ground outside. Keeping low, she skirted the edge of the clearing, using the lengthening shadows as cover. The gunfire continued sporadically at the front of the cabin, punctuated by Barker's shouts demanding surrender. Circling wide, Deanna approached the water trough where Jenkins lay bound. "Miss Rose," he whispered in shock when she appeared beside him. "What in tarnation?" "Shoo," she cautioned, sawing at his ropes with Zach's knife. "We need to even the odds." As soon as his hands were free, Jenkins rubbed his wrists. "Those bastards jumped me on the road. Never even saw them coming." "Can you shoot?" she asked. He nodded. "If I had a gun." Deanna glanced toward the fallen gang members. One lay not far from their position, his pistol still in its holster. "Cover me," she whispered, and before Jenkins could stop her, she darted across the open space between the trough and the dead man. Barker spotted her movement. "There!" he shouted, swinging his gun around. Bullets kicked up dirt at her feet as Deanna dove for cover, the dead man's pistol now clutched in her hand. She slid it across to Jenkins, who caught it deftly. "Stay down," he ordered, raising up to fire at Barker. The unexpected attack from their flank threw the remaining gang members into confusion. Zach, seizing the opportunity, burst from the cabin door, firing with deadly accuracy. His first shot caught the unnamed gang member in the shoulder, spinning him around. Barker, realizing his position was untenable, made a desperate break for his horse. Jenkins fired twice, missing, but Zach's shot caught Barker in the leg as he mounted. The gang leader managed to stay seated, however, and galloped away, leaving his wounded companion behind. The sudden silence that followed seemed deafening. Deanna's ears rang from the gunfire as she cautiously stood. "Is everyone all right?" Zach called, moving toward her with concern etched on his face. She nodded, unable to speak as reaction set in. Her legs trembled beneath her, and she might have fallen if Zach hadn't reached her side, his arm going around her waist to steady her. "That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever seen," he said, his voice a mixture of admiration and exasperation. "I'm not entirely sure which myself," she admitted, leaning against him more heavily than she'd intended. Jenkins approached, still holding the dead man's pistol. "Barker got away, but he won't get far with that leg wound. The other one's still breathing, but not by much." The next hours passed in a blur. Mr. Gregory turned out to have some medical knowledge and tended to the wounded gang member, who was secured in the corner of the cabin. Jenkins, familiar with the territory, estimated they were only 3 hours from the way station on horseback. "I'll take the horses these fellows won't be needing anymore and go for help," he decided. "Should be back by morning with a wagon for the rest of you." No one suggested separating the group after what they'd been through. They would wait together for rescue. As dusk fell, Deanna found herself once again by the fire, Zach at her side. The others had drifted to sleep, exhausted by the day's events. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for protecting us." Zach stared into the flames. "I've spent most of my life looking out for myself. It's different being responsible for others." "You're good at it," she observed. "Better than you let on." He smiled slightly. "Don't go spreading that around. Bad for a gambler's reputation to be known as soft-hearted." "Is that what you are?" Soft-hearted. No, madam. I'm practical. Those men would have killed us all once they got what they wanted. Deanna studied his profile, seeing beyond the dangerous exterior to the man beneath, a man shaped by loss and survival, just as she was being shaped now. Where will you go after this? She asked. When we reach the next town? He shrugged. Wherever the cards take me, I suppose. You still set on California? I don't know anymore, she admitted. It seemed like a destination far enough away to outrun the pain. But after what you said last night about carrying it differently, perhaps distance isn't what I need. What do you need, Deanna Rose? He asked softly, using her full name for the first time. She met his gaze, startled by the directness of the question and the warmth in his eyes. I don't know, she whispered. Purpose, maybe. A reason to keep going. He nodded as if he understood completely. We should get some rest. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges. As predicted, Jenkins returned with help the following morning, a wagon from the way station and 3 armed men, including the station manager. The wounded gang member was taken into custody, and the bodies of the others were loaded onto a separate wagon. Stagecoach will be through in 2 days, the station manager informed them as they settled into the way station's modest accommodations. We'll have you folks on your way then. The way station was a welcome respite after their ordeal. Clean beds, hot food, and the safety of solid walls and multiple armed men standing guard. The passengers from the ill-fated stagecoach found themselves bonded by their shared experience, taking meals together and recounting their adventure with growing embellishment. Deanna, however, found herself withdrawing from the camaraderie, her thoughts increasingly troubled. The events of the past few days had stirred up the grief and anger she'd been trying to outrun. At night, the fire dreams returned, more vivid than before. On the second evening, unable to sleep, she slipped outside to the station's small porch. The night was clear, stars scattered across the vast Wyoming sky like diamond dust. Can't sleep, Zach's voice came from the shadows. He sat in a chair against the wall, a cigarette glowing faintly between his fingers. Every time I close my eyes, I see the flames, she admitted, taking the chair beside him. And now I see Barker's men too. That'll fade in time. Will it? You said the pain doesn't go away. The pain stays. The nightmares eventually give you some peace. He offered her the cigarette, but she shook her head. They sat in companionable silence, watching the stars. Finally, Deanna voiced the question that had been troubling her most. How do you believe in anything after losing everything? After seeing such cruelty? Zach took a long time to answer. I don't know that I do believe, not the way your father would have taught. But I've seen enough of life to know there's balance in it. Darkness and light, cruelty and kindness. When my family died, the townspeople said God had turned his back on us, Deanna said bitterly. As if we deserved what happened. People say foolish things when faced with tragedy. It frightens them to think it could happen without reason, that it could happen to them too. So they invent reasons. My father believed everything happened according to God's plan, she continued. That faith sustained him through every hardship. But I can't see the plan in this. I can't understand a God who would allow such suffering. Zach stubbed out his cigarette. Maybe he doesn't allow it so much as grieve alongside us. Deanna looked at him in surprise. That's an unexpected view from a gambler. He smiled faintly. I've had a lot of time alone with my thoughts over the years, and I've seen both the worst and best of humanity. He paused. Your father preached of a loving God, didn't he? Not one of wrath and punishment. Yes, he believed in redemption above all else. That's why he stayed in that town despite the dangers. He believed everyone deserved the chance to be saved. Then perhaps instead of turning his back, God is simply making room beside him for you. Zach said quietly. Room to question, to doubt, to rage if you need to. And room to find your way back when you're ready. The words settled around Deanna like a warm blanket, not erasing her pain or doubt, but somehow making space for them to exist without consuming her. That's a comforting thought, she admitted. Comfort's in short supply these days. Take it where you can find it. The next morning brought news that changed everything. A telegram arrived for the station manager, and after reading it, he sought out their group with a grave expression. There's been developments in Redemption Creek, he announced. That gang leader, Barker? He was captured trying to get medical attention in a town 20 miles south. Before he died of his wounds, he confessed to a number of crimes, including setting fire to the preacher's house on orders from someone in Redemption Creek. Deanna felt the blood drain from her face. Did he say who? The station manager consulted the telegram. A man named Hollister owns the Silver Spur Saloon in town. Apparently, your father's preaching was cutting into his business, and when the preacher started lobbying to have the saloon shut down for operating gambling tables illegally. Hollister had my family murdered, Deanna whispered, the pieces falling into place. Lawrence Hollister, the wealthiest man in Redemption Creek, owner of not just the Silver Spur but also interests in 2 of the town's brothels. Her father had spoken against him from the pulpit numerous times. The telegram says the sheriff in Redemption Creek has arrested Hollister, the station manager continued. They're holding him for trial, but they're requesting Miss Rose return to testify about the threats her father received. The stagecoach arrived later that day. As the other passengers prepared to continue their journeys, Deanna stood apart, her plans in disarray. She had fled Redemption Creek believing God had abandoned her family. Now, knowing the truth that human greed and cruelty were responsible, she felt both vindicated and adrift. You're going back, Zach said, finding her alone by the corral. It wasn't a question. She nodded. I have to. For justice, if nothing else. Justice won't bring them back. No. But it might help me live with their loss. She turned to face him. What about you? Still headed west? Something flickered in his eyes, hesitation, perhaps, or decision. I thought I might head back to Redemption Creek myself. See how the cards fall there. Hope bloomed unexpectedly in Deanna's chest. It's not much of a town. It has its attractions. His gaze held hers steadily. And I find myself curious to see how this story ends. They traveled back to Redemption Creek together, the journey passing more quickly than Deanna would have expected. Zach proved to be a thoughtful companion, drawing her into conversations that took her mind off the difficult task ahead. By the time they arrived, for days after leaving the way station, Deanna felt stronger than she had since the night of the fire. Redemption Creek looked unchanged, the same dusty main street lined with false-fronted buildings. The small church at one end, saloons and brothels clustered at the other. Yet Deanna saw it with different eyes now. This wasn't a place God had cursed or abandoned. It was simply a place where people made choices, for good or ill. The Wilsons welcomed her return with open arms, insisting she stay with them once more. Zach took a room above the livery stable, promising to accompany her to the sheriff's office the following day. Sheriff Miller seemed genuinely pleased to see her. Miss Rose, your return is providential. Hollister's lawyer has been claiming Barker's confession was coerced. Your testimony about the threats your father received could be crucial. I never heard the threats directly, Deanna admitted. My father didn't share that burden with us. But you can testify to his campaign against Hollister's businesses, and to the events of that night, the sheriff insisted. The judge arrives next week for the trial. As they left the sheriff's office, Deanna realized a crowd had gathered in the street. Word of her return had spread quickly. Some faces were sympathetic, others wary. A few openly hostile. Hollister had friends in town, people who depended on his businesses for their livelihoods. "Head back to the Wilsons," Zach murmured, his hand at the small of her back. "I'll be along shortly." "Where are you going?" His smile held a predatory edge. "To introduce myself to some of the local businessmen. Get a feel for the town." Deanna wanted to protest, but something in his expression stopped her. This was the side of Zachary Blackwell she glimpsed that first day on the stagecoach, dangerous, calculating, a man who made his own rules. "Be careful," she said instead. His expression softened. "Always am, Miss Rose." The week before the trial passed in a blur of preparation. Deanna met with the prosecutor, a serious young man named Phillips who had been sent from the territorial capital specifically for this case. She visited her family's graves for the first time, standing silent before the simple wooden crosses as Zach kept a respectful distance. And each evening, she and Zach would walk through town, ignoring the stares and whispers. He told her stories of his travels, of the strange characters he'd encountered and the places he'd seen. She shared memories of her family, her mother's talent for making something from nothing during lean times, her father's deep laugh that seemed to start from his toes, her brother's mischievous spirit. "They sound like good people," Zach said as they walked back to the Wilsons' house on the eve of the trial. "Your father especially, a man of principle." "He was," Deanna agreed, "though I'm beginning to think his faith was both simpler and more complex than I understood. He saw God's hand in everything, the good and the bad. Not causing the bad necessarily, but present in it." "And what do you see now?" Zach asked. Deanna considered the question. "I'm not sure yet, but I'm starting to believe that even in the darkest moments, we're not abandoned. Not by God, and not by each other." Zach's hand found hers, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "That's a start." The touch sent a current through her that had nothing to do with faith and everything to do with the connection that had been growing between them since that first day on the stagecoach. Deanna knew she should pull away. A respectable preacher's daughter didn't walk hand in hand with a gambler down the main street of town, but she couldn't bring herself to break the contact. The trial began the next morning in the town hall, the largest building in Redemption Creek capable of holding the crowd that gathered. Judge Harmon, a stern man with a reputation for fairness, presided from a makeshift bench at the front of the room. Lawrence Hollister sat with his attorney, looking every inch the successful businessman in his tailored suit. He nodded politely to acquaintances in the crowd, as if attending a social gathering rather than his own murder trial. Deanna sat in the front row beside Zach, who had donned his cleanest shirt for the occasion. His gun still rode low on his hip, however, a silent statement that he was prepared for any trouble. The prosecutor laid out the case methodically: Hollister's documented threats against Preacher Rose, Barker's deathbed confession, the coal oil found at the scene of the fire. Deanna testified about the night her family died, her voice steady despite the emotions churning within her. When Hollister's attorney cross-examined her, his approach was subtle but clear. He sought to portray her father as a zealot whose actions had provoked reasonable opposition from business owners. "Isn't it true that your father regularly condemned Mr. Hollister from the pulpit?" the attorney asked. "That he called him an agent of Satan and worse?" "My father spoke against sin, not sinners," Deanna replied carefully. "He believed in redemption for everyone, including Mr. Hollister. Yet he actively campaigned to have my client's legitimate businesses closed down, did he not?" "He campaigned against illegal gambling and prostitution, yes." The attorney smiled thinly. "And convenient that you alone survived the fire. Some might call that providential." Before Deanna could respond, Zach stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. The judge gavelled for order as Hollister's attorney smirked in satisfaction at the reaction he'd provoked. "Control your friend, Miss Rose," Judge Harmon warned, "or he'll be removed from my courtroom." Deanna placed a restraining hand on Zach's arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. "It's all right," she murmured. "He's trying to provoke us." The trial continued for 3 days, witnesses coming and going. The evidence against Hollister was substantial but largely circumstantial. Without Barker's testimony, the gang leader having succumbed to his wounds, much depended on the jury's willingness to believe his reported confession. On the final day, as the jury deliberated, Deanna and Zach waited in the Wilsons' parlor. She paced restlessly while he remained still, watching her with those perceptive gray eyes. "What if they acquit him?" she asked finally. "What if he walks free?" "Then we deal with that," Zach replied. "But I don't think they will. The evidence is strong, and Hollister isn't as well liked as he believes. He's ruined too many lives in this town." "And if they convict him, what then?" The question hung between them, laden with meaning. What came after justice? What came after vengeance? "Then you decide what's next," Zach said simply. "California is still out there. Or you could stay here, rebuild your father's church. Or go somewhere new entirely." "And where will you be?" she asked, the question she'd been avoiding for days. He held her gaze steadily. "Wherever you want me to be, Deanna." The honesty in his voice took her breath away. This man, this gambler, this gunslinger, this survivor was offering her something she hadn't dared hope for. Not just companionship, but choice. Freedom. Before she could respond, Dr. Wilson burst through the front door. "They've reached a verdict," he announced. "Everyone's gathering at the town hall." The crowd outside the town hall was larger than before, townsfolk pressing close to hear the outcome. Inside, Judge Harmon called for order as the jury foreman stood. "Have you reached a verdict?" the judge asked. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman replied, a weathered rancher named Thompson. "We find the defendant, Lawrence Hollister, guilty of 4 counts of murder in the first degree." A collective gasp went up from the crowd, followed by a mixture of cheers and angry shouts. Hollister himself showed no reaction beyond a slight tightening of his jaw. Judge Harmon sentenced him to hang in 1 week's time, then adjourned the court. As the crowd dispersed, Deanna remained seated, overcome by a wave of emotions too complex to name. Justice had been served, but it brought less comfort than she'd expected. "You all right?" Zach asked quietly beside her. She nodded slowly. "It's over. They're gone, and nothing changes that. But at least now everyone knows the truth." They walked together to the small church where her father had preached. It stood empty now, dust gathering on the pews and pulpit. Deanna moved slowly down the central aisle, memories washing over her, her father's voice ringing out, her mother's quiet strength, her brother fidgeting beside her during long sermons. "I used to sit right here," she said, touching the third pew. "Every Sunday, watching my father speak about God's love and mercy." Zach remained respectfully silent, allowing her this moment of remembrance. "I was so angry," she continued, "at God, at the town, at myself for not being there when they needed me. I thought if I ran far enough, I could outrun the pain." "And now?" he asked. She turned to face him, sunlight streaming through the windows illuminating his face. "Now I think perhaps there are better ways to honor their memory than running away. My father believed in redemption, in second chances." "What kind of second chance are you thinking of?" Zach asked, something like hope flickering in his eyes. "This town needs healing," she said. "It needs someone to remind them that faith isn't about judgment or fear. It's about love and community." She gestured to the empty church. "Maybe that's what I'm meant to do now." Zach stepped closer, his expression serious. "That's a big undertaking for a woman alone in a town like this." "Who says I'd be alone?" she countered, finding courage she hadn't known she possessed. A slow smile spread across his face as he took her hands in his. "Deanna Rose, Are you asking a gambling man to help rebuild a church? I'm asking a good man, a man who understands loss and survival, who protected strangers at risk to himself, who saw value in me when I couldn't see it myself, to consider staying. To consider us. Zach's hands tightened around hers. I'm not the man your father would have chosen for his daughter. Perhaps not, she acknowledged. But I think he would have seen what I see, a man capable of change, of growth. A man worthy of second chances. He drew her closer, one hand rising to gently cup her cheek. I've never stayed in one place very long. Never had reason to. And now I'm thinking maybe it's time to try a different game, he murmured, his face inches from hers. One with higher stakes, but better rewards. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a promise rather than a demand. When they parted, Deanna felt something settle within her, a piece of herself clicking back into place. Not healing, not yet, but the beginning of it. What happens now? She asked softly. Zach smiled, the warmth reaching his eyes. Now we build something new, together. In the months that followed, Redemption Creek witnessed a transformation. The church doors opened once more, though the services held there were unlike those of Preacher Rose's day. Deanna didn't preach, she wasn't ordained, but she organized community gatherings, reading from her father's Bible and encouraging discussions rather than delivering sermons. To everyone's surprise, Zachary Blackwell proved to be an adept carpenter, using skills learned in his youth to repair the church's sagging roof and broken pews. More surprising still was his knack for connecting with the town's most hardened characters, miners and cowhands, who would never have entered a church under Preacher Rose's stern gaze, came willingly when Zach extended the invitation. You have a gift, Deanna told him one evening as they sat on the porch of what was now their home, a small cabin they'd built on the site where her family's house had once stood. Zach raised an eyebrow. For hammering nails? For seeing people as they are, without judgment? For making room for them? He smiled at the echo of his own words from months before. Like God making room beside him for you? Exactly like that, she agreed, leaning her head against his shoulder. You helped me find my way back to faith, you know? Not the same faith I had before, but something truer, I think. More weathered, but stronger for it. I'm not sure I did anything but listen, he demurred. Sometimes that's all it takes. She took his hand, running her thumb over the calluses that had replaced the gambler's smooth touch. Someone to walk beside you through the darkness. 3 years after the fire that had destroyed her family, Deanna Rose became Deanna Blackwell in a simple ceremony in the rebuilt church. Dr. Wilson gave her away, and Mrs. Wilson wept openly in the front pew. The church was filled to capacity not just with the respectable families who had always attended, but with miners and saloon girls, ranch hands and shopkeepers, all coming together to celebrate the union of two people who had found redemption in each other. As they stood before the visiting minister, Deanna glanced up at the man who had changed her life with a simple observation on a stormy night. Zachary Blackwell had put aside his guns and cards, finding purpose in building rather than gambling, in creating community rather than drifting through it. I love you, she whispered as they were pronounced man and wife. His smile was all the answer she needed. 5 years after the fire, Deanna sat on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching Zach teach their 3-year-old son to ride his first pony. Young Matthew, named for her father, squealed with delight as the gentle mare plodded around the yard, his father's steadying hand on his back. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention to the road, where Sheriff Miller, now gray-haired but still spry, rode toward them. Afternoon, Mrs. Blackwell, he called, dismounting at their gate. Just came to let you know we caught those cattle rustlers that have been plaguing the north pastures. Your husband's information was right on the money. Zach had maintained his connections with the less savory elements of society, using them now to help keep the peace rather than skirt the law. His reputation as a straight shooter both literally and figuratively had earned him respect throughout the territory. "That's wonderful news, Sheriff," Deanna replied. "Will you stay for supper? Sarah's bringing her pies for the church social tonight, and I know she always sets aside the best one for you." The sheriff's weathered face reddened slightly at the mention of the young widow, who had become a close friend to Deanna over the years. "I might just do that, thank you kindly." As the sheriff chatted with Zach about the rustlers, Deanna gazed out at the land surrounding their home. The scars of the fire had faded, new growth covering what had once been ashes. Life had continued, as it always did, finding a way through grief to something new. She no longer questioned why God had spared her that night. Instead, she focused on how to use the life she'd been given to build community, to foster healing, to love fiercely. And in those moments when doubt crept in, when the memories of flames threatened to overwhelm her, she remembered Zach's words on that stormy night. God wasn't turning his back. He was making room beside him. Room for questions and doubt. Room for grief and healing. Room for a gambler and a preacher's daughter to find redemption in each other's arms. And in that space, that sacred, hard-won space, Deanna Blackwell had found her way home.